What if I told you that the person you loved most in the world had been living a double life? That everything you thought you knew about your marriage, your finances, and your future was built on a foundation of lies so elaborate that it took a simple car sale to bring it all crashing down? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and 6 months ago I thought I was just a grieving widow trying to get her life back together. I had no idea I was about to uncover a web of deception that would change everything I believed about love, trust, and the man I spent 15 years of my life with. This is the story of how opening a glove box turned my world upside down, and how I fought back against people who thought my grief made me weak. The morning I decided to sell David's car was supposed to be therapeutic. That's what Dr. Reynolds, my grief counselor, had suggested during our last session. "Sarah," she'd said, leaning forward in that way therapists do when they think they're about to deliver profound wisdom, "holding on to material possessions can sometimes prevent us from moving forward. Maybe it's time to let go of some of David's things." The 2019 BMW M3 had been sitting in our garage for 8 months, collecting dust and guilt in equal measure. Every time I walked past it to get to my own car, I felt this crushing weight in my chest. David had loved that car more than anything, except me, or so I thought. He'd spent countless weekends detailing it, upgrading parts one didn't understand, talking about horsepower and torque like other people talked about their children. It was a Saturday morning in early March when I finally worked up the courage to clean it out. The Seattle rain was drumming against the garage roof, creating that rhythmic sound that used to comfort me but now just felt lonely. I'd already contacted 3 different dealerships for quotes, and the numbers were better than I'd expected. The car was worth almost $60,000. Money I desperately needed since David's life insurance had barely covered the funeral expenses and outstanding medical bills. I started with the obvious places. The center console held the usual suspects: breath mints that had expired 2 years ago, a phone charger with a frayed cord, and about $3 in loose change. The cup holders contained old coffee rings and a chapstick that had melted and reformed into something resembling abstract art. Normal husband things. Things that made me smile through the tears because they were so quintessentially David. The back seat was immaculate, as always. David had been obsessive about keeping the interior pristine. I found a single parking receipt from downtown Seattle, dated just 2 weeks before his heart attack. Pike Place Market, it read. He'd told me he was working late that Tuesday. I remembered because I'd made his favorite dinner, chicken parmesan, and had to reheat it twice before giving up and eating alone. That first lie should have prepared me for what was coming, but grief has a way of making you explain away inconsistencies. Maybe he'd grabbed lunch at the market. Maybe he'd been running errands for work. Maybe. I saved the glove box for last, partly because I was procrastinating, and partly because it felt like the most personal space. The most David space. When I finally pressed the release button, it dropped open with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet garage. What I saw first were the expected items: the owner's manual, registration papers, a small flashlight, and a pack of tissues. But there, wedged behind the manual, was something that didn't belong. A bank statement from First National Bank of Washington. The address on the statement wasn't our house. My hands were shaking as I unfolded the paper. The account holder was David R. Mitchell, my husband. But the address listed was for an apartment in Bellevue, about 20 minutes from our home in Redmond. The statement was dated just 3 months before David's death, and the account balance made my knees buckle. $437,000. I stared at that number until the digits seemed to blur together. We had been struggling financially for years. David had been between jobs for most of the previous year, picking up consulting work here and there while I worked double shifts at the hospital to keep us afloat. I'd been clipping coupons, shopping at discount grocery stores, and wearing scrubs that should have been replaced months ago. Meanwhile, my husband had nearly $500,000 in a secret account at an address I'd never heard of. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the transaction history. Monthly deposits of $8,000, regular as clockwork, going back 3 years. The The deposits weren't from any employer I knew about. They were labeled simply as TR monthly, with no further explanation. And the withdrawals, God, the withdrawals. Rent payments to something called Bellevue Gardens Apartments. Utility payments. Grocery store purchases. Restaurant charges from places I'd never been to for meals I'd never shared. David had been living a second life. My vision started to tunnel, and I had to grip the edge of the car door to keep from falling. The garage suddenly felt impossibly small, the walls pressing in on me like a closing fist. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of mistake, some paperwork mix-up that would make sense once I had more information. But even as I tried to rationalize it, my mind was already connecting dots I didn't want to connect. The late nights. The business trips that seemed to come up at the last minute. The way he'd started keeping his phone face down during dinner. The new cologne I'd complimented him on, thinking he was trying to spice up our marriage. I fumbled for my phone and called First National Bank. After 20 minutes of being transferred between departments and explaining my situation to increasingly sympathetic representatives, I finally reached someone who could help. Yes, they confirmed, there was an account under David R. Mitchell's name and social security number. No, they couldn't give me specific details over the phone, but if I came in with proper documentation proving I was his widow, they could discuss the account status. The drive to the bank passed in a haze. I kept the radio off because I couldn't bear to hear anything cheerful, and I kept the windows cracked because I felt like I couldn't breathe. Every red light gave me time to think, and thinking was the last thing I wanted to do. But the thoughts came anyway, relentless and sharp. Who was receiving those rent payments? Who had David been buying groceries for? Who had he been taking to restaurants while I was eating leftover takeout alone in our kitchen? At the bank, a patient woman named Jennifer Martinez walked me through the process of accessing David's account information. She had kind eyes and spoke in the gentle tone people reserve for the recently bereaved, but her kindness only made everything worse. I didn't deserve kindness. I deserved answers. The full account history was even more damning than the single statement I'd found. The TR monthly deposits had been coming in like clockwork for nearly 4 years, totaling over $300,000. But it was the withdrawal patterns that painted the clearest picture of David's double life. Every month, without fail, rent to Bellevue Gardens Apartments, Unit 247, utility payments. A monthly grocery store charge that was roughly equivalent to what I spent feeding both of us. And then there were the other charges. Jewelry stores. Clothing boutiques. A spa in downtown Bellevue. Restaurants I'd only dreamed of being able to afford. Mrs. Mitchell, Jennifer said gently, is there anything else you need to understand about this account? I stared at the papers spread across her desk, each one a small betrayal, together forming a complete destruction of everything I thought I knew about my marriage. What does TR stand for? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She checked the computer screen. It appears to be a business designation, but I don't have more specific information about the source of those deposits. You might need to contact your husband's accountant or business attorney. Business attorney. David had always handled our finances, claiming it was too complicated for me to worry about. He'd been protective of me, he said. He didn't want me to stress about money. How thoughtful of him to shield me from the knowledge that we actually had plenty of money. He was just spending it on someone else. I drove home in a daze, the bank statements in a manila envelope on the passenger seat, like a passenger I didn't want but couldn't leave behind. Our house looked different when I pulled into the driveway. Smaller somehow, more ordinary. It was hard to believe that just 3 hours ago, this had been my home, my sanctuary, the place where David and I had built our life together. Now it felt like a stage set for a play I'd been unknowingly performing in for years. The garage door was still open, the BMW still sitting there with its glove box hanging open like a mouth caught mid-scream. I walked over and looked inside again, hoping I'd somehow missed something, some innocent explanation that would make all of this go away. Instead, I found something I'd overlooked in my initial shock. Tucked behind the registration papers was a small key, not a car key, but the kind of key that opens mailboxes or safety deposit boxes. Attached to it was a tiny tag with an address written in David's careful handwriting. 247 Bellevue Gardens Apt, Unit 247. The same address from the bank statements. I sat in the driver's seat of David's car, holding that key and staring at the address, and for the first time since his death, I wasn't sad. I was angry. White-hot, clarifying anger that burned through the fog of grief I'd been living in for 8 months. David hadn't just hidden money from me, he'd hidden an entire life. And whoever had been sharing that life with him, whoever had been receiving those monthly payments, living in that apartment, enjoying those restaurant meals, had just let me struggle through widowhood alone, never once reaching out to offer condolences or support. They had let me grieve a man who might never have existed, at least not in the way I thought I knew him. I gripped the steering wheel and made a decision that would change everything. I was going to that apartment. I was going to find out who David really was, and who he'd been sharing his secret life with, and then, once I had all the facts, I was going to decide what to do about it. What I didn't know yet was that David's secret wasn't just about another woman, or even another family. It was about something much more complicated, much more dangerous, and much more lucrative than I could have imagined. And the people who had been benefiting from his deception weren't going to be happy to meet the grieving widow who'd stumbled onto their carefully constructed world. But that discovery was still hours away. For now, I sat in my late husband's car, holding the key to his secret life, and felt something I hadn't felt since the day he died. A sense of purpose. I had somewhere to go, something to discover, someone to confront. I wasn't just Sarah Mitchell, the grieving widow, anymore. I was Sarah Mitchell, the woman who was about to uncover the truth. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The drive to Bellevue Gardens took exactly 23 minutes, but it felt like traveling through time. With every mile, I found myself remembering moments from my marriage that I'd previously chalked up to David being thoughtful, protective, or just naturally private. Now those same memories took on a sinister new meaning. I thought about the early days of our relationship back when I was a newly graduated nurse at Seattle General. And David was this charming pharmaceutical sales representative who swept me off my feet with expensive dinners and weekend getaways I couldn't afford on my own. He'd been so generous then, so eager to pay for everything. "Let me take care of you," he'd say, and I'd thought it was romantic. Now I wondered what he'd really been taking care of. We'd met at a medical conference in 2008. I was 26, fresh out of nursing school, and still living in a studio apartment with a roommate's cat because I couldn't afford my own place. David was 32, established, confident, driving a car that cost more than I made in a year. He'd approached me during the lunch break, commenting on my presentation about patient advocacy in cardiac care units. "You really know your stuff," he'd said, flashing that smile that would later become so familiar. "Most people in sales don't really understand the clinical side. Would you be interested in discussing it over dinner?" I should have wondered then why a pharmaceutical sales representative was so interested in my opinion, or how he could afford to take me to restaurants where the wine cost more than my weekly grocery budget. But I was young, flattered, and tired of eating ramen noodles alone while my nursing school friends were all getting engaged to their college boyfriends. David made me feel sophisticated. He introduced me to wine tastings, art galleries, theater performances, a world I'd only seen in movies. When he proposed after 18 months of dating, I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. Here was this successful, worldly man who wanted to build a life with me, a small-town girl from Spokane, whose biggest ambition had been to work in a good hospital and maybe own a house someday. We'd had a beautiful wedding, not extravagant by David's standards, but far more expensive than anything my family could have afforded. My parents had offered to contribute what they could, about $3,000 they'd been saving for years, but David had waved them off. "This is our gift to each other," he'd said. "I want Sarah to have the wedding she deserves." What I deserved apparently was to marry a man I didn't really know. The early years of our marriage had been comfortable, maybe even enviable. We'd bought the house in Redmond within 6 months of the wedding, a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial that I'd fallen in love with despite being terrified of the mortgage payments. David had assured me we could afford it. His pharmaceutical sales job was going well, he said. He was developing relationships with major hospital systems, building a client base that would secure our future. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. And because the alternative, that I'd married someone who would lie to me about something as fundamental as our financial stability, was too terrifying to consider. For the first few years, everything seemed perfect. David traveled frequently for work, sometimes for a week at a time, but he always came home with stories about difficult clients, successful presentations, and the challenges of working in a competitive industry. He'd bring me small gifts from his trips, a scarf from Portland, chocolates from Vancouver, a book from San Francisco, thoughtful tokens that proved he was thinking of me even when we were apart. Or so I'd thought. Now, driving through the tree-lined streets of Bellevue, I realized those gifts might have been guilt offerings, payments for my ignorance, tokens to keep me satisfied while he lived his real life somewhere else. The apartment complex was nicer than I'd expected. Bellevue Gardens wasn't some seedy affair motel or cheap bachelor pad. It was an upscale development with manicured landscaping, a gated entrance, and the kind of amenities that suggested serious money. The monthly rent payments I'd seen on the bank statements suddenly made more sense. This wasn't a temporary arrangement or a casual fling. This was a lifestyle. I parked across the street and stared up at the third-floor windows that corresponded to Unit 247. The blinds were drawn, and there was no sign of life, but someone was paying to keep the lights on. The bank statements had shown rent payments continuing right up until the month before David's death. For all I knew, someone was still living there, still benefiting from whatever arrangement David had made. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister Jessica. "How are you doing today? Remember, you don't have to go through this alone." If only she knew how alone I really was. How alone I'd been for years without even realizing it. Jessica lived in Portland with her husband and 2 kids, and she'd been my lifeline during the worst months after David's death. She'd taken time off work to help with the funeral arrangements, held my hand through the insurance paperwork, and called me every day for the first 3 months just to make sure I was still breathing. She was the one who'd suggested I see Dr. Reynolds when I couldn't stop crying long enough to go back to work. But I'd never told Jessica about our financial struggles. I'd been too embarrassed to admit that David and I were living paycheck to paycheck, despite his supposedly successful career. Too proud to ask for help when the medical bills started piling up after David's heart attack. Too ashamed to reveal that the life insurance payout barely covered our debts. Jessica thought David had been a devoted husband who'd simply been taken too soon. She had no idea that he'd apparently been living a double life funded by mysterious monthly payments of $8,000. I thought about calling her now, but what would I say? "Hey sis, remember how I've been struggling to pay the mortgage since David died? Well, it turns out he had nearly $500,000 in a secret account and was probably cheating on me for years." The conversation felt impossible. Instead, I turned off my phone and got out of the car. The key David had hidden in his glove box felt hot in my palm as I walked across the street toward the building entrance. I'd come this far. I needed to see what was behind door 247. The building had a secure entrance, but as I approached, a young woman in yoga clothes emerged, holding the door open with an absent smile. "Thanks," I murmured, slipping inside before I could lose my nerve. The hallway on the second floor smelled like expensive carpet cleaner and vanilla candles. Everything was clean, quiet, and anonymous in that way that upscale apartment buildings specialize in. I took the elevator to the 3rd floor, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure the other residents could hear it through their doors. Unit 247 was at the end of the hall, around a corner that provided privacy from the other apartments. David's key turned easily in the lock, and the door swung open to reveal a space that made me question everything I thought I knew about my husband's taste, his priorities, and his capacity for deception. The apartment was beautiful. Not just nice, beautiful. Hardwood floors, granite countertops, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of Lake Washington. The furniture was modern and expensive, the kind of pieces I'd admired in magazines, but never imagined owning. Fresh flowers sat in a crystal vase on the dining table, and the refrigerator hummed quietly, suggesting someone had been here recently. But it was the photographs that made my knees buckle. David smiled back at me from multiple frames placed throughout the living room, but he wasn't alone. In every single photo, his arm was around a woman I'd never seen before. She was beautiful in an understated way, long auburn hair, kind eyes, the sort of effortless elegance I'd always envied but never achieved. They looked happy together, comfortable, like they belonged. In one photo, they were hiking somewhere mountainous and green. In another, they were dressed up for what looked like a company holiday party. A third showed them cooking together in this very kitchen, both of them laughing at something off camera. They looked like a couple. They looked like they were in love. I picked up the frame with the holiday party photo and stared at it until my vision blurred. David was wearing a suit I'd never seen before, and the woman was in a red dress that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in a year. They were standing in front of a banner that read Thompson & Associates Annual Celebration 2019. Thompson & Associates. Not the pharmaceutical company David had claimed to work for. I'd never heard of Thompson & Associates, but clearly they were successful enough to throw parties at venues I couldn't afford to park at. The kitchen yielded more clues. The refrigerator was covered with takeout menus from restaurants in Bellevue, appointment cards for a veterinarian I'd never heard of, and a grocery list written in handwriting that wasn't David's. The pantry was stocked with expensive organic foods and brands I recognized from the grocery charges on the bank statements. Someone was definitely still living here. I found more evidence in the bedroom. The closet contained women's clothing in sizes that definitely didn't fit me, along with several of David's suits that I'd assumed he'd donated or lost. The dresser held jewelry that made my wedding ring look modest by comparison, and the bathroom medicine cabinet was filled with prescriptions made out to Elena Rodriguez, birth control pills, allergy medication, and a bottle of antidepressants that was nearly empty. Elena Rodriguez. Finally, the mystery woman had a name. But the most damning evidence was in the home office. David's desk, and it was clearly his desk, covered with his handwriting and his organizational system, held bank statements, business documents, and tax returns that painted a picture of a life I'd never been part of. Thompson & Associates wasn't just David's employer. According to the paperwork, he was a founding partner. The company specialized in healthcare consulting, specifically helping pharmaceutical companies navigate regulatory compliance issues. No wonder he'd known so much about the medical field when we'd met. No wonder he'd been able to afford expensive dinners and weekend getaways on a sales rep's salary. He hadn't been a sales representative at all. The tax returns were the final blow. David's annual income for the past 3 years had been between $200,000 and $300,000. Meanwhile, I'd been working double shifts and clipping coupons because he'd told me we were struggling financially after he'd been laid off from his pharmaceutical job. He'd never been laid off. He'd been living a completely separate professional life while letting me exhaust myself trying to keep us afloat. I sank into his desk chair and stared at the wall of diplomas and awards I'd never seen before. David R. Mitchell, Master of Business Administration, University of Washington. David R. Mitchell, Healthcare Consultant of the Year, Pacific Northwest Business Journal. David R. Mitchell, Founding Partner, Thompson & Associates. Who was this man? Who had I been married to for 15 years? A sound from the hallway made me freeze. Footsteps were approaching, accompanied by the jingle of keys. I heard a woman's voice, muffled but clearly speaking to someone on the phone. "No, I'll be home in an hour. David's memorial service planning is taking longer than expected." Memorial service planning. Elena Rodriguez was planning a memorial service for my husband, a service I'd never been invited to, for a man I'd already buried 8 months ago. The footsteps stopped outside the door. The key turned in the lock, and I had maybe 3 seconds to make a decision that would determine how the rest of this nightmare unfolded. I could hide in the bedroom closet like some cliché detective movie. I could bolt for the balcony and pray for a fire escape. Or I could do something that terrified me more than either of those options. I could stay exactly where I was and face Elena Rodriguez head-on. I chose option 3. The front door opened, and I heard Elena's voice more clearly now. "Mom, I'm telling you, the planning committee has been impossible to work with. They want to hold it at the Fairmont. But David always said he preferred smaller venues." A pause. "Yes, I know it's expensive, but he would have wanted something elegant." She rounded the corner into the living room and stopped dead when she saw me sitting at David's desk. For a moment, neither of us moved. She was exactly as beautiful as she'd appeared in the photographs, but up close, I could see the exhaustion around her eyes, the way grief had carved subtle lines into her face. She was mourning David too, and that somehow made everything worse. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the shock. She was still holding her phone, the call with her mother apparently forgotten. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," I said, standing up slowly, "David's wife." The color drained from Elena's face. She set her phone down carefully on the coffee table, as if sudden movements might cause the entire situation to explode. "That's impossible," she whispered. "David wasn't married." "For 15 years," I said, and watched her world crumble the same way mine had just hours earlier. Elena sank onto the couch, her hands trembling. "But we'd been together for 4 years. We were planning to get married after his divorce was finalized. He said his ex-wife was being difficult about the settlement, that she was dragging things out because she was bitter." Ex-wife. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about any of this. "Elena, I've never filed for divorce. I buried my husband 8 months ago. We had a funeral. I gave a eulogy." She stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "8 months ago, David was here. We had dinner that Tuesday night. He made his famous pasta carbonara. He talked about taking a long weekend trip to Vancouver." Her voice cracked. "He never came home." The timeline hit me like a physical blow. The Tuesday night Elena was describing was the night David had his heart attack. He'd told me he was working late, but he'd been here, having dinner with another woman who thought she was his fiancée. He'd died thinking he could keep us both forever, and we'd both been too in love with different versions of him to see through the lie. "Elena," I said gently, because despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to hate her. She'd been deceived just as thoroughly as I had. "What did David tell you he did for work?" "He was a partner at Thompson and Associates," she said automatically. "Healthcare consulting. He helped pharmaceutical companies with regulatory compliance issues." She paused, studying my face. "What did he tell you?" "That he was a pharmaceutical sales representative who'd been laid off and was struggling to find steady work." We stared at each other across the chasm of David's lies, two women who'd loved the same man without ever knowing he existed. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. Instead, she stood up and walked to the kitchen, returning with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "I think we both need this," she said, pouring generous servings of what I recognized as a very expensive Pinot Noir, the kind David used to bring home on special occasions, claiming he'd gotten a good deal from a client. Now I knew where he'd really been buying it. "How did you find this place?" Elena asked after we'd both taken several sips. I told her about cleaning out the car, finding the bank statements, discovering the key. She listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as pieces of her own puzzle fell into place. "He was always so secretive about his phone," she said finally. "And he traveled constantly. I thought it was just the nature of his work, but now—" She trailed off, staring into her wine glass. "God, Sarah, what kind of man does this? What kind of person maintains 2 completely separate lives, for years?" It was a question I'd been asking myself since finding that first bank statement, but Elena's presence added a new dimension to the mystery. This wasn't just about infidelity or financial deception. This was about a level of calculated manipulation that suggested David had been operating on a completely different moral plane than either of us had imagined. "There's something else," Elena said, setting down her glass, "something I probably should have questioned but didn't because I trusted him." She walked to a bookshelf and pulled out a manila folder. David's business partnerships weren't limited to Thompson and Associates. He had side projects. Investment opportunities, he said, were too good to pass up. She handed me the folder, and I opened it to find contracts, bank routing information, and correspondence that made my head spin. David hadn't just been successful. He'd been involved in ventures that were generating serious money. Real estate development deals, pharmaceutical patent licensing agreements, and what appeared to be consulting contracts with companies I'd never heard of, but whose letterhead suggested they were major players in the healthcare industry. "Elena," I said slowly, "some of these companies, I think they might be clients from my hospital. David always said he didn't know anyone in my professional circle, but look at this." I pointed to a contract with Meridian Pharmaceuticals, a company that had been trying to get their new cardiac medication approved for use at Seattle General for the past 2 years. Oh my God, Elena breathed. He was using information from your work to help his consulting clients navigate hospital approval processes. The pieces were clicking together with horrifying clarity. David hadn't just been living a double life, he'd been using both of his lives to fuel his business success. My casual mentions of hospital politics, new medication trials, and administrative changes had been market intelligence he'd been selling to pharmaceutical companies. Elena's connections, whatever they were, had been another resource he'd exploited. "What do you do for work?" I asked her. "I'm a regulatory compliance officer for the FDA," she said quietly. "I oversee drug approval processes for the Pacific Northwest region." And there it was. David had positioned himself between a hospital nurse with inside knowledge of institutional decision-making and an FDA officer with access to regulatory timelines. He'd been mining both of our professional lives for information he could package and sell to the highest bidder. "He was using us," Elena said, her voice flat with realization. "Both of us. We weren't his wives or his lovers. We were his sources." I thought about all the times David had asked seemingly innocent questions about my work. Which doctors were open to trying new medications? What were the budget constraints for the cardiac unit? How did the hospital administration make decisions about pharmaceutical partnerships? I'd answered every question because I thought he was interested in my career, supportive of my professional challenges. Instead, he'd been building a consulting empire on insider information that neither Elena nor I had realized we were providing. "But here's what I don't understand," I said, still studying the contracts. "If David was making this much money, why was he telling me we were struggling financially? Why was I working double shifts and cutting coupons while he was generating hundreds of thousands of dollars annually?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, then disappeared into the bedroom. When she returned, she was carrying a laptop and a stack of documents that looked official and intimidating. "Because," she said, opening the laptop and turning it toward me, "David wasn't keeping the money for himself. Look at this." The screen showed a banking interface for an account I'd never seen before, but the account holder name made my blood run cold. Sarah and Elena Relief Fund. The account contained over $2 million, and the transaction history showed regular transfers coming from multiple Thompson and Associates accounts, as well as several of the consulting ventures Elena and I had discovered. "Relief Fund?" I said. "Elena, what is this?" "I found it last week when I was going through David's computer files," she said. At first I thought it might be some kind of emergency fund he'd set up for us, but look at the beneficiary information. She clicked through several screens until she reached a document that made me understand why David had been living such an elaborate lie. The Sarah and Elena Relief Fund wasn't a savings account or an investment vehicle. It was a trust fund designed to pay out monthly stipends to both of us for the rest of our lives, but only after David's death, and only if certain conditions were met. According to the trust documents, David had been using his consulting income to build a financial safety net that would ensure both Elena and I were taken care of if anything happened to him. But the trust wouldn't activate until he died, and it included specific clauses about how the money could be accessed and used. "Sarah," Elena said quietly, "I think David knew he was going to die." I stared at the screen, reading the dates on the trust documents. David had established the fund just 6 months before his heart attack, right around the time he'd started complaining about chest pains and fatigue. The same period when he'd been telling me we needed to cut back on expenses because work was slow. "He'd been to a cardiologist," Elena continued, opening another file. "Dr. Patricia Wong at Bellevue Medical, look at this." The medical records she showed me painted a picture of a man who'd known he was living on borrowed time. Severe coronary artery disease, high blood pressure that wasn't responding to medication, and a family history of early cardiac death that David had never mentioned to me. Dr. Wong had recommended immediate lifestyle changes, possibly surgery, and had warned David that his condition was serious enough to be life-threatening. David had ignored all of it. Instead of changing his lifestyle or telling either of his families about his health issues, he'd doubled down on his deception, working frantically to build a financial foundation that would survive his death. "This is why he was working so much," I said, the pieces finally coming together. "This is why he was always traveling, always stressed, always secretive about money. He wasn't just maintaining 2 relationships. He was racing against time to make sure we'd both be okay after he was gone. But Sarah, Elena said, pointing to a specific clause in the trust documents, there's a problem, a big one. I read where she was pointing, and my blood turned to ice. The trust could only be activated if both beneficiaries agreed to its terms and conditions. And one of those conditions was that neither Elena nor I could be married to anyone else at the time of David's death. Since David had never actually divorced me, I was technically still married to him when he died. Which meant Elena, who thought she was his common-law wife, wasn't eligible to access the fund. And since I'd been legally married to David, I couldn't access it either without Elena's consent. Consent she had no legal obligation to give. David had created a financial deadlock that could only be resolved if Elena and I worked together. But there was more. "Keep reading," Elena said grimly. The next clause made my hands shake. The trust included provisions for what would happen if either beneficiary tried to expose David's double life publicly or take legal action against his estate. In that case, the entire fund would be donated to charity, and both Elena and I would lose everything. David had built us a golden prison. He'd ensured our financial security, but only if we agreed to keep his secrets forever. He'd died knowing that Elena and I would eventually discover each other, and he'd structured things so that our only choice would be to become allies in maintaining his elaborate fiction. "He planned this," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "All of it. The double life, the separate accounts, the trust fund. He knew we'd find each other, and he knew we'd have to choose between justice and financial security." Elena nodded, tears finally spilling over. "The bastard trapped us. Even from the grave." I stood up from the desk and walked to the window, looking out at the lake where David and Elena had probably shared romantic dinners while I was working overtime to pay bills that didn't need to be paid. The view was beautiful, serene, everything David had always claimed to love about the Pacific Northwest. But I wasn't admiring the scenery, I was thinking about leverage. Because while David had been brilliant in his manipulation, he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed that Elena and I would be so grateful for his financial provision that we'd accept his terms without question. He'd bet everything on the idea that money would be more important to us than truth. He'd been wrong. "Elena," I said, turning back to face her, "how much do you know about Thompson and Associates' current business operations?" "I know everything," she said. "David made me a signatory on most of the corporate accounts 6 months before he died. He said it was for tax purposes, but now I think he was preparing for this." She paused. "Why?" I smiled for the first time since finding that bank statement. "Because I think David's business partners have been operating under the assumption that he was a bachelor with no family complications. And I'm willing to bet they have no idea that half of their consulting intelligence was coming from insider information that was probably illegal to share." Elena's eyes widened as she understood what I was suggesting. "Sarah, if we expose the information sharing, Thompson and Associates could lose their licenses. The pharmaceutical companies could face federal investigations. Everyone involved could be looking at serious legal trouble." "Exactly," I said. "David thought he was protecting us by tying our financial future to his secrets. But he gave us something much more valuable than money." "What's that?" "He gave us the power to destroy everyone who helped him build his empire of lies. And I'm starting to think that's exactly what we should do." Elena and I spent the next 3 hours turning David's secret apartment into a war room. We spread documents across the dining table, opened laptops on the kitchen counter, and created a timeline on the back of takeout menus that traced every lie, every manipulation, and every illegal exchange of information that had built David's consulting empire. By sunset, we had enough evidence to destroy not just Thompson and Associates, but at least 6 pharmaceutical companies and 2 major hospital systems that had been unknowingly participating in what amounted to insider trading in the healthcare industry. "Look at this," Elena said, highlighting a section of correspondence between David and a company called Therapeutics. David was giving them real-time updates about which hospitals were close to approving their new diabetes medication. He was literally selling them our conversations, Sarah. I remembered those conversations. David had been so interested in my work with the endocrinology department, so supportive when I'd complained about the politics around new medication approvals. He'd listened to me vent about Dr. Hawkins' resistance to change, about how the pharmacy committee made decisions, about which pharmaceutical reps were most effective at winning over skeptical doctors. All of it had been market research he'd packaged and sold for thousands of dollars per report. "And this," I said, pointing to Elena's FDA correspondence that David had somehow accessed, "shows he was giving companies advance warning about regulatory delays and approval timelines. That's federal-level insider trading." Elena nodded grimly. "I gave him my laptop password 18 months ago when his computer crashed during a presentation. I thought I was being supportive. Instead, I was giving him access to confidential federal communications that he was monetizing behind my back." We were both quiet for a moment, absorbing the scope of David's betrayal. It wasn't just personal. It was professional, legal, and potentially criminal on multiple levels. "The question is," Elena said finally, "what do we do with all of this?" I'd been thinking about that question since we'd first discovered the trust fund documents. David had created a situation where Elena and I were supposed to be grateful for his financial manipulation, quiet about his deception, and compliant with his posthumous control over our lives. He'd assumed we'd take the money and disappear into comfortable silence. He'd underestimated both of us. "I want to call my attorney," I said. "But first, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with legally." Elena disappeared into the bedroom and returned with a business card. "David's attorney is Amanda Chen at Chen & Associates. She handled all of his business contracts, including the trust fund setup. I think we should start there." The next morning, Elena and I sat in Amanda Chen's downtown Seattle office, watching a very expensive lawyer realize that her deceased client had created a legal nightmare that could potentially destroy her practice, along with everyone else involved. Amanda was a sharp woman in her early 40s, the kind of attorney who charged $500 an hour and earned every penny of it. But as Elena and I laid out the evidence we'd compiled, I watched her professional composure crack. "Ladies," she said finally, setting down the stack of documents we'd brought, "I need to be very clear about something. If what you're telling me is accurate, David Mitchell wasn't just committing adultery or financial fraud. He was engaging in activities that could be considered espionage under federal law." "Espionage?" I said. "The systematic theft and sale of regulatory information, hospital procurement intelligence, and FDA communications to foreign pharmaceutical companies." Amanda pulled up files on her computer. Some of David's consulting clients weren't just American companies looking for competitive advantages. "Look at this." She showed us contracts with companies based in Switzerland, Germany, and South Korea. David had been selling American healthcare intelligence to international competitors, giving foreign pharmaceutical companies advantages in developing drugs that would compete directly with American products. "This isn't just about your personal situation anymore," Amanda continued. "This is about national security. The FDA, the Department of Justice, and probably the CIA are going to be very interested in David's client list." Elena went pale. "Amanda, I work for the FDA. If this comes out, I won't just lose my job. I could face criminal charges for providing classified information to unauthorized parties." "Not if you cooperate with the investigation," Amanda said. "Elena, you were a victim here just as much as Sarah was. David manipulated both of you into providing information you didn't know was being used illegally. The question is whether you want to be witnesses or subjects of the investigation." I knew what she was really asking. We could either come forward voluntarily and help the authorities unravel David's network, or we could wait for them to discover it on their own and potentially face charges as unwitting accomplices. "What about the trust fund?" I asked. "If we expose all of this, we lose the money." Amanda smiled for the first time since we'd walked into her office. "Actually, you don't. David was clever, but he wasn't as clever as he thought he was. The trust fund was built using the proceeds of illegal activities. Under federal asset forfeiture laws, that money was never legally his to distribute, which means the government will seize it as part of their investigation." "So we lose it anyway," Elena said. "Not necessarily." Amanda pulled out a thick legal binder. "There's a federal whistleblower program that provides financial compensation to individuals who help expose illegal activities in regulated industries. If you two come forward with this evidence and assist in the investigation, You could be entitled to a percentage of any fines or asset recovery that results from the case. She opened the binder to a page that made my eyes widen. Healthcare fraud cases at this level typically result in settlements in the tens of millions. Whistleblower compensation can range from 15 to 30% of recovered funds. Elena and I looked at each other across Amanda's polished conference table. David had thought he was trapping us with his posthumous financial manipulation, but he'd actually handed us the keys to a much larger kingdom. "There's one more thing," Amanda said. "David's business partners at Thompson & Associates have been continuing to operate using the intelligence networks he established. They don't know he's dead." "What do you mean they don't know he's dead?" I asked. "Elena, you've been signing contracts and handling correspondence under David's instructions for months after his death, right?" Elena nodded slowly. "He'd set up automated responses and had me handle routine business communications. He said it was to maintain client relationships while he focused on bigger projects. I thought I was being helpful." "You were maintaining his cover," Amanda said. "As far as Thompson & Associates knows, David Mitchell is still alive, still generating intelligence reports, and still funneling information through his sources at the FDA and Seattle General Hospital." The implications hit me like a freight train. David's business partners had been unknowingly committing fraud with a dead man for 8 months, using intelligence that Elena and I were still inadvertently providing through our normal work activities. "They're going to keep operating until someone stops them," I said. "Exactly. And when the federal investigation begins, they're going to be caught completely off guard. They'll have no time to destroy evidence, hide assets, or prepare legal defenses." Amanda leaned forward, her expression intense. "Ladies, you have the opportunity to bring down one of the largest healthcare intelligence fraud operations in federal history. The evidence you've uncovered could expose corruption in multiple federal agencies, dozens of pharmaceutical companies, and hospital systems across the country. But," Elena said carefully, "if we do this, our names will be public. We'll be testifying in federal court, probably multiple times. Our careers, our privacy, our entire lives will be scrutinized." "Yes," Amanda said simply, "that's the trade-off. You can remain silent, forfeit the trust fund, and hope David's network never gets exposed through other means. Or you can take control of the narrative, help bring justice to everyone who's been harmed by this fraud, and potentially walk away with enough money to secure your futures on your own terms." I thought about the months I'd spent grieving for a man who'd never really existed, working double shifts to pay bills while nearly $500,000 sat in a secret account, believing I was alone in the world, while another woman planned memorial services for the same husband. David had stolen years from both of our lives. He'd used our love, our trust, and our professional expertise to build an empire that enriched him and his associates, while keeping Elena and me in carefully constructed boxes of ignorance and dependence. But he'd also given us something he hadn't intended, the power to tear it all down. "Elena," I said, "what do you think?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring out Amanda's office window at the Seattle skyline. Finally, she turned back to us with a look of determination I was beginning to recognize in myself. "I think," she said slowly, "that David spent 4 years teaching me everything I need to know about regulatory compliance and federal law enforcement procedures. And I think it's time I put that education to good use." Amanda smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that. Because tomorrow morning I'm calling the FBI, and you two are going to tell them everything." As we left Amanda's office, Elena and I walked in silence toward the parking garage. We'd just committed to a course of action that would irrevocably change both of our lives. There would be no going back, no changing our minds once we started cooperating with federal investigators. "Sarah," Elena said as we reached our cars, "are you sure about this? Once we make that call, we're not just exposing David, we're exposing everyone." I thought about Dr. Reynolds asking me when I'd be ready to let go of David's things. I thought about the sympathy cards from friends who praised David's devotion to our marriage. I thought about the financial stress that had kept me awake nights, while David maintained a luxury apartment and a secret relationship. "Elena," I said, "for 8 months I've been mourning a man who never existed. I've been beating myself up for not being a better wife to someone who was never really my husband. I think it's time both of us stopped protecting David's memory and started protecting ourselves." She nodded, and I could see the same resolve in her eyes that I felt building in my chest. David Mitchell was about to become famous for all the wrong reasons. And Elena Rodriguez and Sarah Mitchell were about to become the women who brought down one of the most elaborate fraud schemes in federal history. The war was about to begin. Special Agent Rebecca Torres had the kind of presence that made you understand why people confessed to crimes they didn't commit. She was maybe 5'6", but when she walked into Amanda Chen's conference room that Tuesday morning, she commanded the space like a general entering a battlefield. Her partner, Agent Michael Crawford, was quieter but no less intimidating, the kind of man who noticed everything and revealed nothing. "Mrs. Mitchell, Ms. Rodriguez," Agent Torres said, settling into her chair with a stack of files that was already thicker than anything Elena and I had compiled. "We've been investigating Thompson & Associates for 18 months. Your husband's death actually flagged our attention because several of his consulting reports stopped updating right around the time of his cardiac event." Elena and I exchanged glances. The FBI had already been watching David's operation before we'd even discovered it existed. "What we didn't have," Agent Crawford added, "was inside access to how the intelligence was being gathered and distributed. Your evidence fills in gaps we've been trying to close for over a year." Agent Torres opened one of her files and spread photographs across the table. They showed David at business meetings, David entering and leaving Thompson & Associates, David having dinner with people I didn't recognize at restaurants I'd never been to. The surveillance had been extensive and thorough. "Your husband was what we call a bridge operator," she explained. "He positioned himself between legitimate sources of confidential information and parties who were willing to pay premium prices for competitive intelligence. What made him particularly valuable was his ability to maintain relationships with sources who had no idea they were contributing to illegal activities." "Us," Elena said flatly. "You and approximately 12 other individuals across the healthcare industry." David Mitchell had built a network of romantic relationships, friendships, and professional connections that gave him access to insider information from hospitals, regulatory agencies, pharmaceutical companies, and medical research facilities across the Pacific Northwest. The number hit me like a physical blow. Elena and I weren't David's only victims. We were just two sources in a much larger operation that had been systematically exploiting healthcare professionals for years. 12 other people? I asked. Agent Torres nodded. "We've identified relationships with nurses at 4 different hospital systems, 2 other FDA compliance officers, 3 pharmaceutical company executives, a medical research coordinator at the University of Washington, and 2 hospital administrators. All of them believed they were in exclusive romantic relationships with David Mitchell." The conference room went silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning. Elena had gone completely white, and I felt like I might be sick. David hadn't just been living a double life with Elena and me. He'd been operating what amounted to a romantic intelligence network, manipulating more than a dozen healthcare professionals into providing him with confidential information. "How is that even possible?" Elena whispered. "How does someone maintain relationships with 14 different women without any of us knowing about the others?" Agent Crawford pulled out a tablet and showed us a map of the Pacific Northwest with different colored pins marking locations across Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. Careful scheduling, multiple identities, and an extraordinary attention to detail. David Mitchell had apartments in Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, and Vancouver. He had different business cards for different relationships, separate social media profiles, and what appears to be an eidetic memory for keeping his stories straight. "He told me he traveled for consulting work," Elena said. "I never questioned why he was gone so much because his explanations always made sense." "He told me he was struggling to find steady employment," I added. "I thought his irregular schedule was because he was picking up freelance work wherever he could find it." Agent Torres made notes as we spoke. David's operation was sophisticated enough that we initially suspected he was working for a foreign intelligence service. The level of organization, the financial resources, the operational security, it was beyond what we typically see from individual fraud cases. "But he wasn't a spy," Agent Crawford said. "He was something potentially more dangerous. A freelance intelligence broker who was selling American healthcare information to the highest bidder, regardless of their nationality or intentions. Amanda Chen, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. "Agents, what exactly are you asking my clients to do?" "We want them to help us execute a controlled operation to expose the full scope of David's network," Agent Torres said. "Elena has access to his business communications and financial accounts. Sarah has knowledge of how he gathered intelligence from hospital sources. Together they can help us identify every person and organization that was involved in this operation." "And the other women?" I asked. "The other sources David was manipulating?" "That's where it gets complicated," Agent Crawford said. "We need to approach each of them carefully. Some of them may have been fully aware of what they were doing and were receiving compensation for their information. Others, like the two of you, may have been unknowing victims." Agent Torres opened another file, this one containing photographs and basic biographical information about the other women in David's network. Looking at their faces, nurses, administrators, researchers, all of them intelligent professionals who'd been expertly manipulated, I felt a surge of anger that was different from anything I'd experienced during my grief. These women had trusted David with their hearts and their careers. They'd shared confidential information because they thought they were talking to someone who loved them, someone who was genuinely interested in their professional challenges and successes. Instead, they'd been feeding intelligence to a man who was selling their trust to finance a lifestyle none of them knew existed. "What's the timeline for this operation?" Elena asked. "We want to move quickly," Agent Torres said. "Thompson and Associates is currently negotiating a major contract with a consortium of European pharmaceutical companies. If that deal goes through, the scope of the intelligence sharing will expand internationally, and our ability to prosecute under domestic law becomes much more complicated." "How quickly?" Amanda asked. "We'd like to begin surveillance and evidence gathering this week. We'll need Elena to continue her normal business communications with Thompson and Associates, while wearing recording devices and following specific protocols we'll provide. Sarah will need you to help us understand the hospital intelligence networks and possibly make controlled contact with the other healthcare professionals David was exploiting." The weight of what they were asking settled over me like a heavy blanket. They wanted me to become an active participant in exposing not just David's fraud, but a network that had been operating for years and involved people I might know professionally. "What happens to the other women when this comes out?" I asked. Agent Crawford's expression softened slightly. "That depends on their level of involvement and their willingness to cooperate. The ones who were unknowing victims will likely be offered immunity in exchange for testimony. The ones who were actively participating in the fraud," he shrugged, "they'll have to face the consequences of their choices." Elena was studying the photographs of the other women, her face grim. "Some of these faces look familiar. I think I may have met them at Thompson and Associates events. David always said they were clients or business partners, but now I'm wondering if he was actually bringing his sources together in the same room." "That's exactly what he was doing," Agent Torres confirmed. "We have surveillance footage from several Thompson and Associates social events where multiple women from his network were present simultaneously. He was remarkably skilled at managing group dynamics and preventing his sources from comparing notes." I thought about the company holiday party photo I'd seen in Elena's apartment. How many of the other women in David's network had been at that party, believing they were David's guest while other women believed the same thing? "There's something else you need to know," Agent Torres said, her tone becoming more serious. "Thompson and Associates hasn't been operating in isolation. We believe they're part of a larger network of healthcare intelligence brokers that spans multiple states and possibly multiple countries. David's death may have disrupted their Seattle operations, but the larger organization is still active. Which means," Agent Crawford added, "if we don't move quickly, they'll adapt their methods and continue operating without him. All of the people he was exploiting will remain vulnerable to manipulation by other operators in the network." That decided it for me. I wasn't just seeking justice for David's betrayal of Elena and me anymore. I was fighting for 12 other women who'd been manipulated, exploited, and potentially placed in legal jeopardy by a man they'd trusted with their hearts and their careers. "What do you need us to do?" I asked. Agent Torres smiled. and for the first time it reached her eyes. "We need you to be exactly who you are. Intelligent, observant women who are angry enough to see this through to the end. The rest, we'll teach you." Over the next 4 hours, Elena and I received what amounted to a crash course in undercover operations. We learned how to wear and operate recording devices, how to ask questions that would elicit incriminating responses, how to maintain normal behavior patterns while gathering evidence, and most importantly, how to stay safe while dealing with people who might become dangerous once they realized their operation was being exposed. "The most important thing to remember," Agent Crawford emphasized, "is that you're not alone in this. We'll have surveillance teams monitoring all of your interactions, and we'll have backup protocols in place if anything goes wrong. But you need to understand," Agent Torres added, "once we begin this operation, there's no going back. Thompson and Associates will eventually realize they're being investigated. When that happens, they'll likely become aggressive in trying to protect themselves and their remaining assets." Elena looked at me across the conference table where we'd just committed to bringing down an international fraud network. "Sarah, are you sure you're ready for this?" I thought about the woman I'd been 8 months ago, grieving, financially struggling, isolated in my suburban house with my memories of a marriage that had never really existed. Then I thought about the woman I was becoming. Informed, angry, and armed with evidence that could protect other people from experiencing the same betrayal Elena and I had endured. "Elena," I said, "I've spent 8 months mourning a lie. I think it's time I started living in the truth." Agent Torres handed us each a business card with a secure phone number. "Your first assignment is tomorrow. Elena, you're going to attend the Thompson and Associates staff meeting and gather intelligence about their current client list and ongoing projects. Sarah, you're going to help us make contact with the first of David's other sources." "Who?" I asked. "Dr. Patricia Williams, head of pharmaceutical procurement at Tacoma General Hospital. According to our intelligence, she was one of David's longest-running sources, and she may be the key to understanding how the entire network operates." As Elena and I left the FBI building, we walked in silence toward our cars. The Seattle afternoon was gray and drizzly, typical for March, but something about the weather felt appropriate. We were about to enter a storm that would change everything for everyone involved. "Elena," I said as we reached the parking garage, "tomorrow everything changes." "Good," she said, her voice steady and determined. "I'm tired of being David Mitchell's victim. It's time to become his downfall." I drove home through traffic that seemed insignificant compared to the weight of what Elena and I had just undertaken. By this time tomorrow, we'd be federal informants working to expose a fraud network that had been operating for years. We'd be putting our careers, our safety, and our futures on the line to seek justice for crimes we'd only discovered by accident. But for the first time since David's death, I felt like I was moving forward instead of just surviving. I wasn't just Sarah Mitchell, the grieving widow, anymore. I was Sarah Mitchell, federal whistleblower, and tomorrow the real work would begin. The first recording device felt like wearing a live grenade. The FBI technical team had fitted me with what they called a pen recorder, a writing instrument that looked completely normal but could capture audio from 20 feet away with crystal clarity. As I walked through the corridors of Tacoma General Hospital toward Dr. Patricia Williams' office, every click of my heels on the linoleum seemed impossibly loud. Dr. Williams had agreed to meet with me after I'd introduced myself as David Mitchell's widow. "He mentioned you several times," she'd said over the phone, her voice warm with what sounded like genuine affection. I was so sorry to hear about his passing. David was special. The way she said special told me everything I needed to know about their relationship. Dr. Williams's office was exactly what I'd expected from a department head at a major hospital. Organized chaos, medical journals stacked 3 feet high, and coffee cups in various stages of abandonment scattered across every available surface. She was in her early 50s, attractive in the way that successful professional women often are, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of confidence that comes from making life-or-death decisions on a regular basis. "Sarah," she said, standing to greet me with a warmth that made my stomach turn. "Please, sit down. Can I get you coffee? Water?" "Coffee would be great," I said, settling into the chair across from her desk and discreetly activating the recording device. "Thank you for making time to see me, Dr. Williams. I know how busy you must be." "Patricia, please, and of course. David spoke about you so often." He was incredibly proud of your work at Seattle General. Proud. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing bitterly. David had been proud of my work because my work had been making him money. I wanted to talk to you about David's consulting business, I said, following the script Agent Torres had coached me on. I'm trying to settle his estate, and there are some financial questions I'm hoping you might be able to help clarify. Patricia's expression shifted slightly, a wariness creeping into her eyes. What kind of questions? Well, his business records show regular consulting fees from Thompson and Associates, but I'm having trouble understanding exactly what services he was providing. You knew him professionally, didn't you? Yes, we worked together occasionally. Patricia moved some papers around on her desk, a nervous gesture that suggested she was choosing her words carefully. David was very knowledgeable about pharmaceutical procurement processes. He helped me understand some of the more complex regulatory requirements. That's interesting, I said, leaning forward slightly, because I'm a nurse myself, and I'm curious about how pharmaceutical procurement works at the hospital level. It seems like such a complicated process. What followed was 20 minutes of the most damning confession I'd ever heard. Patricia, apparently relieved to have someone to talk to about her relationship with David, described in detail how she'd been sharing confidential hospital procurement timelines, budget information, and competitive bid details with David for over 3 years. He was so easy to talk to, she said, her voice taking on a dreamy quality that made me want to shake her. David understood the pressures I was facing, the impossible decisions about which medications to approve when budgets were tight. He never judged me for complaining about hospital politics or difficult pharmaceutical reps. And he never asked you to keep your conversations confidential? Well, yes, but only because he said some of his other clients were competitors. He didn't want to create conflicts of interest. Patricia paused, seeming to realize she might be saying too much. Sarah, why are you asking about this? Is there some kind of problem with David's business practices? I'd reached the moment Agent Torres had prepared me for, the point where I needed to start gathering specific evidence that could be used in court. Patricia, did David ever ask you to provide written reports about pharmaceutical procurement decisions? Email summaries, spreadsheets, anything like that? The question hit its mark. Patricia's face went ashen, and she started fidgeting with her coffee cup. Sometimes he asked for clarification about things we'd discussed. Nothing formal, just friendly communication between professionals. Do you still have copies of those communications? Sarah, I think maybe we should. Patricia, I interrupted, dropping my voice to a whisper and leaning across her desk. I need you to listen to me very carefully. David wasn't who you think he was. He wasn't who any of us thought he was. For the next 10 minutes, I told Patricia everything. About Elena, about the other women, about the international pharmaceutical companies that had been paying for her confidential hospital information. I watched her face cycle through disbelief, denial, anger, and finally, a kind of horrified understanding. You're telling me, she said slowly, that David was selling information I gave him in confidence? That my procurement decisions were being shared with companies that were bidding against the vendors I was supposed to be evaluating fairly? Patricia, it's worse than that. Some of the companies he was selling to were foreign competitors trying to undercut American pharmaceutical companies. Your information may have contributed to international economic espionage. She stood up abruptly and walked to her office window, staring out at the parking lot where ambulances were arriving and departing in the endless cycle of emergency medicine. I could lose my medical license, she said quietly. I could face criminal charges, my career, my reputation, everything I've worked for. Or, I said, standing up and joining her at the window, you could help us make sure that David's network doesn't destroy anyone else's life the way it's destroyed ours. I explained about the FBI investigation, about the opportunity to cooperate rather than become a target, about the other women who'd been manipulated and exploited by David's operation. Patricia listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions that showed she was already thinking like someone planning to cooperate rather than someone planning to run. What would I have to do? She asked finally. Help us understand how David's network operated from the hospital side, provide evidence of the information sharing, and possibly help us approach some of the other healthcare professionals who were involved. Patricia was quiet for a long moment, then returned to her desk and unlocked her computer. Sarah, there's something else you need to know. something that might be bigger than David's individual operation. She pulled up what appeared to be a secure messaging platform I'd never seen before. David introduced me to this communication system about 2 years ago. He said it was a way for healthcare professionals to share insights and best practices across different institutions. I thought it was a professional networking tool. I looked at the screen and felt my blood run cold. The messaging platform contained group conversations involving dozens of healthcare professionals from hospitals across the country. They were sharing procurement information, regulatory updates, patient demographic data, and competitive intelligence that should never have been centralized in a single system. Patricia, this isn't a networking tool, this is a data collection operation. I know that now, she said miserably, but look at the user list. There are people from the Mayo Clinic, Johns Hopkins, Cedars-Sinai, Massachusetts General. This goes way beyond David's personal network. I activated my phone's camera and started documenting what I was seeing, following Agent Torres's instructions to gather as much evidence as possible during my initial contact with Patricia. The scope of the operation was staggering. David hadn't just been manipulating individual women for information. He'd been building a centralized intelligence platform that connected healthcare professionals across the entire country. Patricia, I need you to come with me, I said. We need to get this information to the FBI immediately. But before Patricia could respond, her office phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and her face went white. It's Thompson and Associates, she said. They've never called me directly before. Answer it, I said. Act normal. Don't mention our conversation. Patricia picked up the phone with a trembling hand. Dr. Williams speaking. I could hear a male voice on the other end, smooth and professional. Patricia, this is James Thompson from Thompson and Associates. I'm calling because we've had some irregular activity on our secure communication platform. Have you noticed anything unusual in your recent interactions? Patricia looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. The FBI had told us that Thompson and Associates would eventually realize they were being investigated, but none of us had expected it to happen this quickly. No, Patricia said, her voice remarkably steady. Everything seems normal on my end. What kind of irregular activity? We've detected unauthorized access attempts and some unusual data queries. We're conducting a security review of all platform users. I'll need you to come in tomorrow morning for a brief meeting to verify your account security. After Patricia hung up, we stared at each other across her desk. The investigation that had seemed methodical and controlled just hours earlier was suddenly accelerating beyond anyone's ability to manage it. They know, Patricia said. Somehow they know someone's been looking into their operation. I thought about Elena, who was supposed to be attending a Thompson and Associates staff meeting at that very moment while wearing an FBI recording device. If the company was conducting security reviews and detecting unauthorized access attempts, Elena might be walking into a trap. Patricia, I need to make some calls. But first, I need you to pack up everything related to David's network. Every email, every document, every communication you've ever had with Thompson and Associates. We're leaving here together, and you're going to tell the FBI everything you know. As Patricia gathered evidence from her office, I stepped into the hallway and called Agent Torres's secure number. She answered on the first ring. Agent Torres, we have a problem. Thompson and Associates just called Dr. Williams about irregular activity on their secure platform. They're conducting security reviews of all users. Damn, she said. We knew this was a possibility, but we'd hoped for more time. Where's Elena right now? She should be at their staff meeting. I'm sending backup to her location immediately. Sarah, you need to get Dr. Williams out of that hospital and to our safe house as quickly as possible. If Thompson and Associates is conducting security reviews, they may try to eliminate evidence or silence sources who could expose their operation. Eliminate evidence? Agent Torres, what exactly are we dealing with here? A criminal organization that's been operating for years and has millions of dollars at stake. Sarah, these people aren't just going to accept exposure quietly. They're going to fight back, and they have resources we're still trying to understand. I hung up the phone with a new understanding of what Elena and I had gotten ourselves into. This wasn't just about seeking justice for David's betrayal anymore. We'd stumbled into the middle of a federal investigation involving international fraud, economic espionage and criminal organizations that apparently had the resources and motivation to eliminate evidence, including human evidence. Patricia emerged from her office carrying 2 briefcases full of documents and a laptop bag. "Sarah, I've been thinking about what you said. About David manipulating other women the same way he manipulated me. There's something else you need to know." "What?" 3 months ago, one of the other women in the secure messaging platform stopped participating, Dr. Jennifer Mason from Portland General Hospital. David told us she'd taken a new position at a hospital in Phoenix. But now I'm wondering if that was true. "Why?" "Because 2 weeks ago I saw an obituary in the Portland Tribune. Dr. Jennifer Mason died in a car accident. Single vehicle collision, late at night, no apparent cause for the crash." The parking garage suddenly felt very cold and very dangerous. "Patricia," I said, "we need to leave here right now, and we need to make sure Elena is safe." As we hurried toward our cars, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Mrs. Mitchell, we need to talk. You've been asking questions about things that don't concern you. Stop now, or face consequences you're not prepared for." The war had officially begun. The FBI's safe house in Bellevue looked like any other suburban rental property from the outside, but inside, it buzzed with the controlled chaos of a federal operation in overdrive. Agent Torres had 3 laptops running simultaneously, Agent Crawford was coordinating with field teams through an encrypted radio system, and Elena sat at a monitoring station, her face pale but determined as she reviewed audio recordings from her morning at Thompson & Associates. "Sarah," Agent Torres said as Patricia and I arrived with our evidence, "we have a situation. Elena's recording from the staff meeting revealed that Thompson & Associates is planning to liquidate all of their domestic assets and relocate their operation to Switzerland within the next 72 hours. Elena looked up from her headphones. "It's worse than that. James Thompson wasn't just conducting security reviews. He was identifying which sources might be compromised and making contingency plans to deal with them." "Deal with them how?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. "Listen to this," Elena said, adjusting the playback system so we could all hear. James Thompson's voice filled the room, crisp and businesslike. "The Mitchell situation has created exposure points we can't ignore. Dr. Williams in Tacoma has been asking unusual questions, and we've detected unauthorized access attempts on the secure platform. I want a full audit of all source communications from the past month, and I want contingency protocols activated for anyone who might be considered a liability." Another voice, younger and more anxious. "James, when you say contingency protocols, are we talking about termination of business relationships or—" "I'm talking about whatever level of intervention is necessary to protect this organization," James interrupted. "We've invested too much time and money to let a few panicked widows destroy everything we've built." The recording continued with logistical discussions about moving assets offshore, destroying digital records, and what James Thompson euphemistically called source management. By the time Elena stopped the playback, we all understood that Patricia and I weren't just witnesses to a fraud investigation. We were targets of a criminal organization that was preparing to eliminate evidence. "Patricia," Agent Crawford said, "how many people have access to the secure messaging platform you showed Sarah?" "Maybe 60 or 70 healthcare professionals across the country," Patricia said. "But James is right. There are probably 15 or 20 of us who've shared information that could be considered compromising if it were ever made public. And those people don't know they're in danger," I said. Agent Torres was already on her phone coordinating with FBI field offices across the country. "We're implementing emergency protection protocols for all identified sources," she said after hanging up. "But we're talking about healthcare professionals in dozens of cities who have no idea they've been participating in an illegal intelligence operation." "There's something else," Elena said, pulling up another audio file. "After the staff meeting, I stayed behind to talk to James Thompson privately. I told him I was concerned about the security issues and asked if there was anything I should be worried about. His response was illuminating." She played the second recording, and James Thompson's voice filled the room again, but this time he sounded less controlled, more personal. "Elena, I want you to understand something. David Mitchell wasn't just our partner. He was our protection. He had relationships with sources who trusted him implicitly, and he managed those relationships in ways that kept everyone comfortable and cooperative. Without David, we're exposed. What do you mean, exposed? Elena's recorded voice asked. I mean that some of our sources might start asking questions if they're not handled properly. Questions about how their information was being used, who was receiving their reports, why they were never compensated for their intelligence. David was a master at keeping people happy and ignorant. The rest of us were not as subtle. There was a pause, then James continued with what sounded like genuine concern. Elena, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Have you been in contact with David's wife? My blood turned to ice as I heard Elena's response. His wife? James, David wasn't married, he was divorced. His ex-wife lived in Portland and they hadn't spoken in years. That's what David told you, but our background research suggests otherwise. Sarah Mitchell has been making inquiries about David's business activities, and she's been asking questions that suggest she knows more than she should about our operations. Elena's recorded voice became more strained. What kind of inquiries? She contacted First National Bank about David's accounts. She's been to his apartment in Bellevue. And yesterday she met with Dr. Patricia Williams at Tacoma General for over an hour. Elena, I think David's widow is trying to expose our entire operation. Agent Torres paused the recording. That was 12 hours ago. By now, they've almost certainly figured out that Elena is working with us. As if summoned by her words, Elena's phone began ringing. The caller ID showed James Thompson, Thompson and Associates. Answer it, Agent Crawford said. Act normal. We need to know what they're planning. Elena activated the speakerphone so we could all hear the conversation. James, hi, I was just about to call you. Elena, we need to meet immediately. There's been a development in the security situation, and I need to brief you on some new protocols. Of course. Where do you want to meet? The office isn't secure anymore. Come to the warehouse facility on Harbor Island. Do you know where that is? Elena looked at Agent Torres, who was frantically typing notes and shaking her head. I'm not sure exactly. Can you text me the address? Elena, this is urgent. Don't stop anywhere, don't talk to anyone, and come alone. We have reason to believe that David's widow has been working with federal investigators, and if that's true, everyone associated with this operation is in immediate danger. The line went dead. Agent Crawford was already coordinating with tactical teams before Elena had even set her phone down. Harbor Island Warehouse District is industrial, isolated, and has multiple exit points. If they're calling Elena there, it's either for an emergency evacuation or to eliminate a potential witness. They wouldn't actually hurt Elena, would they? Patricia asked, her voice shaking. Agent Torres looked at her with the kind of professional sympathy that suggested she'd seen too many cases where criminal organizations had done exactly that. Dr. Williams, we're dealing with people who've been operating an international fraud network worth millions of dollars. Elena has evidence that could send multiple people to federal prison for decades. What do you think they're willing to do to protect themselves? The tactical planning that followed was like watching a military operation unfold in real time. Within 30 minutes, Agent Crawford had positioned surveillance teams around the Harbor Island facility. Agent Torres had coordinated with the Seattle Police Department's SWAT unit, and a federal prosecutor named Michael Hartley had arrived to oversee what was rapidly becoming a multi-agency operation. Elena, Agent Torres said, you're not going to that warehouse. We'll send in an undercover agent wearing your recording equipment. No, Elena said firmly. James Thompson knows me personally. He'll recognize immediately if someone else shows up pretending to be me. And if you send in an obvious federal agent, they'll just deny everything and claim this was all a misunderstanding. Elena, if Thompson and Associates is desperate enough to eliminate witnesses, going to that warehouse could be a death sentence. And if I don't go, they'll disappear to Switzerland, and all of the evidence disappears with them, Elena countered. Agent Torres, how many other women are still out there providing information to networks like this one? How many Dr. Jennifer Masons are going to die in quote-quote car accidents if we don't stop this now? I understood what Elena was really saying. This wasn't just about seeking justice for David's betrayal anymore. It was about protecting women who were still being manipulated and exploited by criminal organizations that viewed their sources as disposable assets. I'm going with her, I said. Both agents started to object, but I cut them off. Elena's right, they know her, and they expect her to come alone. But they also expect her to be scared and compliant. They're not expecting her to bring David's widow, the woman who started this entire investigation. Elena looked at me with something that might have been admiration. Sarah, that's incredibly dangerous. So is letting these people escape to continue their operation in another country, I said. Agent Torres, how many women like Patricia, like Elena, like me are going to be manipulated and exploited if Thompson & Associates successfully relocates their network overseas? The prosecutor, Michael Hartley, spoke up for the first time. Actually, having Sarah there might give us a strategic advantage. If James Thompson believes he's dealing with two grieving women who stumbled onto something they don't understand, he might reveal more than he would to someone he suspects is working with federal investigators. Or he might kill them both and dispose of the evidence, Agent Crawford pointed out. Not if we do this right, Agent Torres said, her expression shifting from concern to operational focus. Elena, you're going to go to that warehouse, but you're going to be wired for both audio and video. Sarah, you're going to follow 20 minutes later, also wired, and you're going to walk in claiming you followed Elena because you're desperate to understand what happened to your husband. What's the real objective? I asked. Get James Thompson to admit, on record, that Thompson & Associates was knowingly purchasing stolen government and healthcare information. Get him to acknowledge that they were aware some of their sources were being manipulated. And, if possible, get him to reveal information about the broader network and their international operations. Elena stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the Seattle skyline that had been the backdrop for David's deception and would now be the setting for his network's downfall. There's something I haven't told anyone, she said quietly. Something David said to me the night he died. We all turned to look at her. He was having chest pains during dinner. I wanted to call an ambulance, but he refused. He said he had something important to tell me first, something that would explain why he'd been so secretive about his work. Elena's voice was barely above a whisper. He said that if anything ever happened to him, I should find Sarah Mitchell and tell her that everything he'd done had been to protect us from the people he was working with. Protect you how? Agent Torres asked. He said Thompson & Associates wasn't just a consulting company. He said they were part of something much larger, something international and dangerous. He said he'd been building evidence against them for months, waiting for the right time to expose their operation. The room went silent as the implications of Elena's revelation sank in. Elena, Agent Crawford said slowly, are you telling us that David Mitchell was planning to become a whistleblower against his own criminal network? I think he was planning to bring down Thompson & Associates and use the evidence to protect all of the women he'd been manipulating. I think he knew he was dying, and he was trying to find a way to expose the criminal operation without destroying the lives of the people he'd exploited. I stared at Elena, trying to reconcile this new version of David with the man who'd lied to me for years about our financial situation. Had he been protecting me from something worse than deception? Had his manipulation been motivated by something other than pure selfishness? If that's true, I said, then David's death wasn't just convenient timing for us to discover his network. It was a catastrophe for Thompson & Associates because they lost their main source of protection and intelligence. Which means, Agent Torres said, they're not just desperate to escape, they're desperate to tie up loose ends that David was supposed to handle before he died. Loose ends like Elena and me, I said. Exactly, which is why this warehouse meeting isn't just about damage control, it's about elimination. Elena and I looked at each other, understanding that we were about to walk into a confrontation that could either bring justice to dozens of exploited women or result in our own disappearance. Agent Torres, Elena said, what are the chances that Elena Rodriguez and Sarah Mitchell walk out of that warehouse alive if we do this operation? Agent Torres was quiet for a moment, then looked at both of us with the kind of honesty that federal agents probably weren't supposed to share with civilian informants. If we do everything right, if our surveillance teams are positioned correctly, and if James Thompson doesn't realize you're working with us until it's too late, maybe 70%. And if we don't do this operation, I asked. Then Thompson & Associates disappears to Switzerland, continues their operation internationally, and more women like Dr. Jennifer Mason start dying in convenient accidents. Elena and I had 90 minutes to prepare for what might be the last conversation of our lives. The Harbor Island warehouse sat like a concrete fortress against the gray Seattle sky, surrounded by shipping containers and industrial equipment that created perfect cover for FBI surveillance teams. As Elena and I approached the building in separate vehicles 20 minutes apart as planned, I could see the tiny red dots of laser sights tracking our movements from hidden positions. Agent Torres's voice crackled through my nearly invisible earpiece. "Sarah, Elena's inside. We have visual confirmation of 4 individuals in the main warehouse space, including James Thompson. Remember, your objective is to get them talking about the broader network. Act emotional, not tactical." I took a deep breath and walked through the warehouse entrance, letting my real anxiety fuel the performance I was about to give. Elena was standing in the center of a circle formed by 3 men in expensive suits, and 1 woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a corporate boardroom. They all turned to stare at me as my footsteps echoed in the vast space. "Elena?" I called out, letting my voice crack with what sounded like panic. "Thank God I found you. I followed you here because I need answers about David, and I think these people have them." James Thompson stepped forward, and I immediately understood why David's sources had trusted him. He was handsome in a distinguished way, with silver hair and the kind of confidence that suggested he was accustomed to getting whatever he wanted. But his smile didn't reach his eyes, and there was something predatory in the way he assessed me. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said smoothly, "I was hoping we'd have a chance to meet. David spoke about you often." "Did he?" I said, letting anger creep into my voice. Because apparently David spoke about a lot of things that weren't true. Like the fact that he was married to me while planning to marry Elena. David's personal relationships were complicated, James said, but they were also irrelevant to his professional activities. What matters now is making sure that certain confidential business information doesn't become public in ways that could harm innocent people. Elena stepped closer to me, playing her part perfectly. "Sarah, Mr. Thompson has been explaining that David's consulting work involved sensitive client information. If details about his business activities were to be disclosed inappropriately, it could damage the careers of healthcare professionals who are just trying to do their jobs." "Healthcare professionals like Dr. Patricia Williams?" I asked, watching James Thompson's face for a reaction. His smile became more strained. Dr. Williams was one of several consultants who provided David with insights about pharmaceutical procurement processes. Perfectly legal consulting relationships. "Is that what you call stealing government information and selling it to foreign companies?" I said, dropping the pretense of confusion and letting my real anger show. "Legal consulting?" The temperature in the warehouse seemed to drop 10 degrees. The other 3 people in James Thompson's circle shifted their positions, and I noticed for the first time that at least 2 of them had bulges under their jackets that suggested they were armed. "Mrs. Mitchell," James said, his voice losing all pretense of warmth, "I think you may have misunderstood the nature of David's business activities." "I understand perfectly," I said. "David was manipulating women in the healthcare industry to steal confidential information that you were selling to the highest bidder, and when those women started asking questions, you eliminated them." "That's a very serious accusation," the corporate woman said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was ice-cold professional. "I hope you have evidence to support such claims." "As a matter of fact, I do." I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila envelope containing copies of the documents Elena and I had compiled. James Thompson's eyes widened as he recognized bank statements, pharmaceutical contracts, and correspondence that detailed the scope of his organization's activities. "Where did you get those?" he demanded. "David's apartment," Elena said. "The one you didn't know about. The one where he kept records of everything, including contingency plans for exposing Thompson and Associates if you ever threatened the women he was using as sources." It was a bluff, but it was a good one. James Thompson's composure cracked completely. "That's impossible," he said. "David was completely loyal to this organization. He would never have created exposure risks." "David was dying," I said. "He knew he had a bad heart, and he knew that when he was gone, you'd find other ways to exploit the women he'd been manipulating. So he documented everything." Elena pulled out David's laptop and opened it to show the secure messaging platform. Every conversation, every intelligence request, every payment authorization. It's all here, James, and copies are already in the hands of federal investigators. The warehouse erupted into chaos. James Thompson lunged for the laptop while shouting orders to his associates. The corporate woman was already on her phone, presumably calling their international contacts to warn them about the exposure. The two armed men moved to block the warehouse exits. But Agent Torres and her teams were ready. FBI, nobody move. Tactical agents poured through every entrance simultaneously, flooding the warehouse with shouted commands and automatic weapons. James Thompson froze with his hands halfway to Elena's laptop, and the corporate woman dropped her phone as if it had become molten metal. The arrest sequence took less than 3 minutes, but it felt like hours. Elena and I were hustled to safety while federal agents secured evidence and read rights to 4 people who had clearly never expected to be taken into custody on American soil. "Sarah, Elena," Agent Torres called out as the warehouse was secured. "Are you both all right?" "We're fine," Elena said, though her hands were shaking. "Did we get everything we needed?" Agent Crawford approached us with a grim smile. "You got more than we hoped for." James Thompson was so focused on the immediate threat that he started making phone calls to international contacts while our recording equipment was active. We now have evidence of criminal operations in 6 different countries. Over the next 6 hours, as Elena and I gave our statements at FBI headquarters, the scope of the investigation expanded exponentially. The secure messaging platform yielded contact information for healthcare professionals across North America who had been unknowingly providing intelligence to criminal organizations. Thompson and Associates' financial records revealed money laundering operations that connected to pharmaceutical companies in Europe and Asia. Most importantly, James Thompson's attempt to coordinate an emergency evacuation had exposed the broader network's command structure and operational methods. "Ladies," Agent Torres said as we concluded our statements, "you've helped us break open one of the largest healthcare intelligence fraud cases in federal history. The initial arrests are just the beginning." "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we work our way through the network systematically. Every person who was exploited gets protection and immunity in exchange for testimony. Every person who was knowingly participating gets prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law." 6 months later, I stood in the witness box of a federal courthouse in downtown Seattle, looking out at a gallery filled with women I'd never met but whose stories had become intertwined with mine. Patricia Williams was there, along with 11 other healthcare professionals who'd been manipulated by David's network. Elena sat in the front row, no longer the frightened FDA officer who'd discovered her boyfriend's deception, but a confident federal witness whose testimony had already helped convict 3 Thompson and Associates executives. The prosecutor, Michael Hartley, concluded his questioning with a simple request. "Mrs. Mitchell, in your own words, please tell the court why you decided to cooperate with this investigation." I looked at the defendant's table, where James Thompson sat in an orange jumpsuit, no longer the distinguished businessman who'd tried to intimidate Elena and me in that warehouse. He'd pled guilty to 18 federal charges rather than face trial, but his sentencing hearing was an opportunity for his victims to speak publicly about the impact of his crimes. "Your Honor," I said, "when I found that bank statement in my husband's car, I thought I was dealing with a personal betrayal. I thought David had been cheating on me, lying about our finances, and living a double life that was just about his inability to be faithful to his marriage." I paused, gathering my thoughts. What I discovered was that David's deception was part of a criminal enterprise that had been systematically exploiting women in the healthcare industry for years. Women who dedicated their careers to helping people, to saving lives, to making medical care better and more accessible. Elena nodded encouragingly from the gallery. These women trusted David Mitchell and his associates with their professional insights, their personal struggles, and their confidential information, because they believed they were in relationships built on love and mutual respect. Instead, they were being manipulated by criminals who viewed their expertise as a commodity to be harvested and sold. James Thompson was staring at his hands, refusing to make eye contact. I decided to cooperate with this investigation because 12 other women deserved to know the truth about what had been done to them. Because Dr. Jennifer Mason deserved justice for the, quote, car accident that silenced her before she could expose this network. And because there are probably dozens of other women in other cities who are still being exploited by organizations like Thompson and Associates. The judge nodded as I concluded my statement. Mrs. Mitchell, thank you for your courage in bringing this case forward. James Thompson received a sentence of 25 years in federal prison. His associates received sentences ranging from 15 to 20 years. Thompson and Associates was dissolved, and its assets were liquidated to provide restitution to the victims of their fraud network. The whistleblower compensation Elena and I received totaled just over $4 million. More money than either of us had ever imagined having, but money that came with the knowledge of how much David's network had cost its victims in terms of careers, reputations, and lives. A year after the warehouse confrontation, Elena and I met for coffee at a small cafe in downtown Seattle. She'd left the FDA and started her own consulting firm, helping healthcare organizations implement ethical compliance programs. I'd taken early retirement from nursing and was using my portion of the whistleblower funds to establish a legal defense fund for healthcare professionals who'd been exploited by intelligence fraud networks. Sarah, Elena said, stirring sugar into her latte, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't decided to clean out David's car that day? I thought about the question seriously. James Thompson's network would still be operating, Dr. Jennifer Mason's death would still be classified as an accident, and you and I would still be mourning a man who never really existed. Do you think David really was planning to expose Thompson and Associates before he died? It was a question I'd been grappling with for months. The evidence suggested that David had been documenting his network's criminal activities, but whether he'd been planning to become a whistleblower or simply gathering insurance against his own associates remained unclear. I think, I said finally, that David got in over his head with people who were more dangerous than he'd realized. I think he understood that he'd put both of us in jeopardy, and he was trying to find a way to protect us without destroying the lives of the other women he'd manipulated. But he died before he could follow through. So we followed through for him. Elena smiled, and I realized that our friendship, born out of shared betrayal and mutual deception, had become one of the most honest relationships in my life. We'd seen each other at our worst, learned the most painful truths about someone we'd both loved, and emerged stronger for having faced those truths together. Sarah, what are you going to do with the rest of your life? I looked out the cafe window at the Seattle street where people were hurrying past, focused on their own concerns and challenges. Most of them would never know that they were safer because Elena and I had been willing to confront a criminal network that had been operating in their city for years. I'm going to make sure that what happened to us doesn't happen to other women, I said. I'm going to use David's blood money to protect people from the kind of exploitation we experienced. And personally, are you going to try dating again? Marriage? I laughed, surprising myself. Elena, after being married to a man who was simultaneously married to 13 other women without any of us knowing it, I think I'm going to focus on relationships that are a little less complicated. Like friendship? Like friendship. We finished our coffee and walked together toward the parking garage where this entire journey had begun. Not this specific garage, but the symbolic space where I'd first opened David's Glovebox and discovered that my life was built on a foundation of lies. Now, a year later, I was walking away from that same symbolic space with a friend who understood exactly what I'd survived, a bank account that ensured I'd never be financially vulnerable again, and the knowledge that I'd helped protect other women from experiencing the same betrayal. David Mitchell had thought he could control our lives even after his death. He'd underestimated the power of two women who refused to remain victims of his manipulation. The last I heard, the international investigation Elena and I had sparked was still ongoing, with criminal cases pending in 4 different countries. The healthcare intelligence fraud network we'd exposed had been larger and more sophisticated than even the FBI had initially realized. But Elena and I had started something that was bigger than any criminal network, a movement of healthcare professionals who were no longer willing to be silent about exploitation and manipulation in their industry. As I drove home that afternoon, past the lake where David and Elena had once shared romantic dinners while I worked overtime to pay unnecessary bills, I realized that I'd finally found something David had never been able to give me. I'd found myself. And I was free. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.